to the Tough Fish Show. I am so excited to bring to you Angela Hughes. Angela, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be on this podcast.
I am so glad you are, and I would love for you to start with how did you get into writing?
Well, I have always been a creative, and as a child, I was making up stories. In fact, I always like to share the story that I was a very hyperactive child. And we didn't have the unlimited devices that have nowadays to entertain themselves. And one of the things that my mom discovered really worked for me, though, was to put on headphones, and we had record players back then. We put on a record, and I would listen to classical music for hours. It was funny. My favorites were the Indiana Jones soundtrack and the E.T. soundtrack. That's what we had on record. And I would listen, but as I listened, what was gripping me wasn't just the sound of the music, it was that stories would play. And I couldn't get enough of them. I would be inserting myself inside the story, whether it was being the hero or encountering dragons or whatever it was, my imagination would just roll. And so growing up, I put a lot of that imagination into my art, and I never really felt that I belonged in the group of authors. I remember in high school, I took a professional writing course, and that was the first time I went, wow, I really love this. But still, I had this opinion that I was too free spirited, that authors were these scholastic type smarty pants people, and I didn't belong to that club. So being a writer wasn't something that I was meant to do. And it wasn't until probably about 4 or 5 years ago, the story started just not letting me go. I'd always been a storyteller in my mind. I'd had other ways of telling stories, but I was like, man, I wish there was someone who would write this book. It's just epic. And one day I realized that somebody was me. And it took me a while to become brave enough to do that. One of the pivotal moments for me was actually, I'd already decided I was going to write the book, scared, so I hadn't really started. And I went on a trip to Northern Ireland. And I was actually standing on a hill overlooking this beautiful landscape. I could see, the ocean, and I could see green hills, and it was very beautiful. But behind me was a giant stone that had inspired C.S. Lewis's stone table in The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I had told no one besides my family that I was thinking of daring to write a book. And they barely believed in it. They were like, oh, Angela and her sweet little pipe dreams, go Angela. But I could feel that they didn't really buy that I could be a writer either at that point. And here I am standing looking at this beautiful landscape, and a friend of mine puts his arm around me and he said, it's time to start writing those stories. This is the time. The mantle is on you. And I just took that as a sign, and I never looked back. And I got home and I started writing, and I had my first book written in 8 months.
Okay, so I have goosebumps. First off, I just love that story. And I love the way the inspiration came to you and that you were receptive to that. The fact that you might have been concerned, you might have been working through some fears even, but yet you still were willing to take that first step. Even if it was a baby step, you still took the first step, and then another and another, and 8 months later, you wrote a book. I really love that so very much. So I'm curious, what kind of lessons did you learn from that?
I learned that, number one, I had an original design to write that I never knew I had. The minute my fingers started typing on the keys, I connected with a part of myself that I had never been allowed to before. All of that imagination space that I had spent so much time living in, I now had a place to express that. And I realized that all of my preconceived ideas of what an author was or a writer was kind of an error. But one of the things I discovered as a writer just all of the stuff, all of the doubts that continue to just ping in your imagination as you're trying to write the story. Who are you? Who do you think you are? You don't get to do this. You're not even a good writer. Just all of those things constantly pinging in my memory. And I came to a place where I realized if I really want to have powerful characters and a powerful story to tell, that I need to get emotionally healthy. I need to get to a place where I can do this bravely and strongly and even violently, because, stories need to really be expressive and be emotional. And I discovered that a lot of my characters were coming out flat because that was where I was as a writer. I was still afraid. And I noticed that as I started getting in touch with that bravery and started getting more healthy, my characters got brighter and stronger, and I became a braver writer, and, even got darker in some ways and brighter in other ways when it came to writing my stories and my character arcs. And so for me, there were a lot of lessons. I feel like I came out on the other side of my first book as an entirely different person. My projection of who I was and where my life was going completely changed. And I had transformed. It's kind of like you go through pregnancy. By the end of pregnancy, you've transformed and you become a mom. And I kind of felt like I had like a book baby, like I had this
Yeah.
book, I had this story in me that needed to come out. And by the end of writing my story, I had transformed and become a new person. And I realized there was nothing else I'd rather be doing with my life than writing stories.
Okay, again, goosebumps. I feel like I should go grab a little blanket or something because this is just awesome. Angela, I love how you described that you recognizing the growth you needed
Yeah.
helped your characters and helped them both. And to be able to, what I really hear you describing is to create complexity in the characters, not just honoring a trope, not just honoring, okay, I have a protagonist and an antagonist, but you really it really helped to push your writing to have strong characters. And strong doesn't necessarily mean nice or
Right.
likable, just relatable in the sense of you can see something. And I love how you describe that. And I also love the fact that you recognize the growth that you had after you wrote the book. You were able to look back and say, look at what I've accomplished. Look at this. Look at how I've grown, how I've changed for the better because of it. And
Yes.
I think that that's so powerful because sometimes when you're going through that, you don't always see that unless somebody is reflecting it back to you or saying, "Hey, this you're doing really well," or "I can tell that you seem more joyful because you've been," and then you're realizing, "Oh, I wrote today," or "That was a
Yes.
fun writing experience," or "I finished up my first round of edits and that I'm really proud of the work I did. It was difficult work, but I enjoyed it, or it was meaningful and I felt good about it." You might start connecting. I feel this, and this is what I did. And that's kind of what I hear you doing.
Yes. Yeah. It was really essentially important for me as a storyteller, for me to become someone willing to grow,
Yeah.
and develop. And it came across on the page. I just noticed, I think your characters, even if they're not you, they're a piece of you. They're a part, they're coming from your imagination. And so for me to be a good storyteller, I had to become healthier, stronger, braver in a lot of different aspects.
As you mentioned that with characters, one of the things that's coming to me is whether I'm writing on a piece or I'm editing someone else's, when I'm looking at the characters, especially if I'm editing someone else's, I will act out what that is to kind of feel what
Mm,
they're doing because it becomes more essentially visceral. It becomes a little bit more like, is this really how they would respond? Or I'm finding my body is doing this. Do I see that on the page? Do I really feel that on the same connection on the page? Or
mm,
is there a disconnect that we could close the gap? Meaning, am I feeling something that's not really what's intended? Or that's intended, but we need to strengthen it to really drive it
mm,
home because then the reader, when the reader feels it, that's really what you want. Even if the reader wants to close the book and go, "Oh, okay, what would happen? Oh, what just happened?" that's a really great response. Or
Yes.
when you have a situation where, somebody goes, I really don't like that character. You're like, good. You weren't
Yes.
supposed to. So, so tell me what else comes up for you, like how you go about developing characters? Are there some tips and tricks that you've cultivated over time?
Well, for me, I have a love for history and I have a love for mythology. And so a lot of my characters are wrapped up in a real historical context, but very fantasy as far as, magical creatures and all of that. But I think for me as a writer, one of the things that makes my writings unique is that I have a very strong emotional drive in my books and a reason for in each arc. There needs to be something that my characters are going through emotionally, but I didn't want it to be the typical fantasy arcs. For me, I wanted to deal with real life issues. So I wanted to take my characters who are living in these fantasy worlds, but have real life crisis. So, for example, I have a younger Merlin character at the beginning of my books. So this premise, my books start after Arthur's death, and you have this younger Merlin who's in grief. Arthur's dead, the kingdom's falling apart, all of the promises, all of the things that have been promised. And I don't know how many people in their life are like, this isn't how it was supposed to be. This isn't the promise. This isn't what I expected of life. It threw me for a loop. I've been working towards this goal all of my life, and this one thing ruined everything. And so I have this character who's experiencing real life grief.
I like that.
And so for me, that was a very important focal point, really understanding grief and that maybe grief doesn't just go away. And for Merlin in my story, he's given up. And the question is, and this is what I'm answering throughout the series, the question is there anything on the other side of everything being lost?
I
Is
love
there
that.
a reason to hope again? Can we resurrect through the ashes like a phoenix? And then also with my character, Eleanor, she's fatherless. She's been orphaned. What is it like being somebody who walks through destiny and purpose when you don't think you're anything special or significant and you'd rather hide away? And these to me were real human experiences, not just the experiences of characters in a fantasy story, but human experiences that people actually walk through every day. And I wanted people to be able to relate to that, bringing in real experiences, real insecurities, and allowing those to develop over time. Like, what is the lesson that my characters are going to be learning in the end? Where are we headed? Even if I don't have all of the dots lined up yet, I want to know that in the end, my characters are going to arrive at some kind of revelation or some kind of journey that brings them to a turning point.
Yeah.
And I want my readers to be cheering for them. So I want to be giving just enough hope that even in the midst, so we're on book 3 and there's tragedy still happening. So you've got Merlin who's like, I'm finally starting to feel like maybe I can hope again. And yet all of these things continue to occur. Like, can we have faith when bad things still do happen? Like, we didn't come out on the other side. Now everything's roses. And has Merlin really learned his lesson as far as can he now have hope even when things continue to go wrong? So that's kind of, for me, it's very important for me to have characters that emotionally connect with the readers, or someone who's actually been there, experienced tragedy or fatherlessness, and has been there before.
I think that is powerful. And I love that you talk about it in the context of this is where he is, understanding the grief journey, because it's also not yes, there's stages of grief. However, it's not that you necessarily just you move from one stage to a next stage, but you don't slip to go back to one of the other stages because something happens in your world that you're like, okay, I thought I was doing fine until that. I kind of
Right.
liken grief in the context of you have a wound, and when the wound first happens, it hurts.
Yeah.
It's ugly, it's painful, you're in a lot of pain. And then the healing process, it doesn't just poof heal overnight. It has to like if it's a gash on your hand or your arm or what have you, the skin has to start to try to move through that pain and start
Yes.
to form until you get a scab, and the scab is not comfortable, the scab is obnoxious, and if the scab gets off because it scratches or something is abrasive and it bumps up against it and it was too fragile, oh well, it's gonna hurt again, and then but that wound is not nearly as big as it was before, and
Yes.
then you still have the scar at some point, but you can look at the scar a little differently. So
Yes.
that's what I hear you really showing, because it's not just as simple as, okay, well, this happened, and in the grief process there's anger, and anger just happens like that, and I move through it. No, no,
Mhm.
you're gonna move in different phases, but you ultimately do come back to, you do get to a form of peace. And then
Yes.
when you kind of cycle through again because something happens, maybe it's the anniversary of something or a reminder of something, maybe it doesn't hurt nearly like it used to, but you still have a
Yes.
moment to remember. And that's what I hear you also capturing.
Hmm.
Love that. Love that. So I have a question for you. As we were chatting before, I know you're a writing coach, and I would love to hear how you help writers create characters like you do, or to tap into that emotion, to be able to create an experience for their reader, or even just to help themselves get out of their own way to get the first few words on the page or to finish what they started.
Yes. I find with writers, especially those who are just starting out, there's a lot of commonalities, even my own experience, where there's so much fear hindering us from taking those first steps to even start. Or maybe we've started, but we have only gotten so far. And I know a lot of people, they think that they have to have the perfect story written, the manuscript just absolutely edited as they're writing. And that's actually a trap. You really want to actually make a big mess. You want to be able to write, but in the midst of that, there is so much just emotionally that can hinder us from writing a good story or being able to be brave enough to start in the first place. And a lot of that comes with just dealing with your fear and giving yourself permission to write and giving yourself the understanding that you have the capabilities to learn and grow. Like maybe you're not where you want to be when you first write your manuscript. But I guarantee you, just like playing the violin, you're not going to learn how to play if you don't pick up the instrument and start playing it. And it's the same with writing. Well, start practicing, start writing your story. Maybe by the time you get to the end, um, it's not exactly where you want it to be, but that's the beauty. And honestly, was my favorite experience as a writer was now you get to do the rewrites. And I know a lot of people, they dread the rewrites. They're like, oh my gosh, now I've got to rewrite it. And I'm like, no, this is where you get to take all of the lessons and refine, and your story actually grows and gets better. It's like your first draft, it's the bones. And then
Mhm.
developmental editors, they get to come in and actually help us learn how to tell the story. And if we don't get past the fear in the beginning, when we first start writing, getting into the editing can be even more horrifying and a scary process. And for me, because I had gotten past so much of the fear at the beginning, when I got to the developmental stage and editors working on my book, it was my favorite part of the storytelling process, because now I had partners to help me develop my story, things where I had blind spots or areas where I hadn't matured yet as a writer. Now I had the opportunity to learn and grow and really become an excellent author. And these are things that when people are starting out, they think, I should know all this already. I'm like, well, why don't you start playing your instrument? Why don't you start getting over some of the fear, the things that hinder your writing? But my biggest piece of advice when people come in who want to write a book, are you reading? Are you reading other people's books? Same genre that you're writing, even. Because I feel like writing, a lot of people, they think it's the solitary, lonely profession. I have the opposite viewpoint. I feel like the more author community you have, the more authors and books that you're reading, the more your own skills grow, your vocabulary grows, your ideas for stories grow, and then other authors can even help inspire your growth and encourage you when you're feeling doubtful or fearful. And so those are some of the beginning steps. I really like to get authors into the headspace with their characters because honestly, even with my character dealing with grief, I needed to get in that headspace, and that can be kind of scary. Understanding grief, really going there and not being afraid to make it ugly. I think sometimes our own fears and insecurities, like Eleanor, my character really fell flat because I, as a person, sometimes don't like to be disruptive. I don't like it when I cause other people to be uncomfortable. And I was really writing her as that character, and it was making her flat. And I was like, no, Eleanor needs to make a mess, make people a little uncomfortable. Maybe her emotions are a little erratic, and I don't have to keep everybody. And it actually helped me grow as a person and go, you know what? I get to be loving, I get to be kind, but I also don't have to always worry about how other people are perceiving me all the time and how I am, making other people feel if I'm feeling uncomfortable or whatever. And I think that's an important part of writing powerful characters, like really dive in. And
Yeah.
I, was listening to one of your podcasts and I heard about it was called the Emotional Thesaurus. And I was like, wow, that sounds like a fantastic book. I definitely want to check that out because as writers, sometimes we need to grow and learn how to express the emotions of our characters in different ways. And what a fantastic resource that is.
I'm so glad. Thank you for mentioning that. I believe
Yeah.
that's Eileen Cook's book. So
Yeah.
very, very, very cool. And so you mentioned something that I think is really important to tap into, whereby you as the writer are, when you're pushing yourself, therefore pushing your writing, you might need to go to a place that is uncomfortable or that does feel sad or dark or what have you. So how do you get out of it so that you leave what you create, you leave it, where it was? So for instance, how do you get into that space? How do you transition from your day, so to speak, into that space to be able to write? You've done your writing, and then how do you transition out?
Well, I know for me, when I'm writing a very emotional scene or something that's very emotionally charged, like a death or someone dealing with deep grief, I write it in layers. I can't get it all out at once. So I allow myself the process of not having to be so, fully engaged that I am disrupting myself. So I'm writing it in layers and measuring my own emotions as I'm writing it. But I know sometimes, like I've written some very scary scenes, or I've written scenes that were very emotionally tolling, or somebody has died. I'm never happy when I kill one of my heroes. I'm like, it aches me to write those. And honestly, and those I have to spend so much time in those scenes. And I think that's number one. What I do is I take my time, so that I'm not having to like just full force myself into this scene. So it's layers and layers. So I allow those scenes to kind of grow and become what they're meant to become. But one of the things I do is I walk out after writing a scene like that, and I tell my kids and my husband, I'm really sad. I just wrote something really sad. And I let them know that I'm like that. And I'm like, so let's do something like to reset. Sometimes if I don't have my family to cheer me up, maybe get me a cookie and turn on some happy music, I'll jump into something that I know is good therapy for me. And like one of the
Mhm.
things that I love to watch is The Office. I can watch it over and over and over again, and it's easy laughter for me.
Mhm.
So I will definitely do something to kind of pull myself, okay, this isn't where I live. This is my characters. This is my story. Now let's reset and do something to kind of shift gears. But I also give myself time. I'm very intentional with my schedule. I homeschool my kids. I also work for a publishing company. And so I have to be very intentional with my schedule. And I know because my books are so emotionally driven that I need to have time that's undistracted so that I really can. And it takes me a while. I sometimes have to go back and reread the previous chapter and really get myself in the emotional space of my characters so that I can jump in and connect emotionally and give myself that 3 or 4 hours of writing time that I've scheduled to really let myself feel and engage in those feelings or really allow myself to even imagine, because there are experiences that my characters have that I have never experienced. But to think of the movie scenes or the things where I have seen that have affected me in that same vein, to really connect and put that in words in my story.
What I hear you also describing are boundaries. The process in and of itself is a way to help you ease yourself in and out, which I love your process. It's something that I resonate with for my own pieces. Like even if it's not charged, I still need to ease into it by rereading different pieces so I'm in that flow. And even if the writing time wasn't so successful in my world, or if it felt like, oh, that was just not coming together like I wanted, and I'm a little more frustrated with it, leaving to do something that does bring joy, to your point, or does make me laugh, type of thing, that helps to transition that too. So, but what I hear you describing are also boundaries. This is the framework, these are the windows that I can do this. And you're protecting it too, just like you're
Mhm.
protecting the space for homeschooling or running your business or doing the work for the publishing company. All of them sound like that there are spaces for each one that you're honoring.
Yes.
And I hear you guiding in that way. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. You hit the nail on the head. I have to be very intentional and understand what each space is for. Especially, since I am a very imaginative person, I can take my stories with me all day long, all throughout everything that I do. When I go to bed at night, oftentimes I'm meditating on my stories and I'm thinking about them. And so I do have to be careful that I'm not carrying the trauma parts with me. It's fine.
Mhm.
Imagine a story, imagine how it's going to develop in the next chapter. But you can lull yourself into connecting too deeply. You want to have compassion, but maybe not empathy when you're not writing.
Mhm. Yeah.
Because you're connecting differently with your characters at different times. So yeah, and I have to say I haven't had a massive struggle with that, being able to disconnect myself from the story and being able to snap myself back into my vibe. I tend to be a fairly happy, buoyant personality anyway. And so being able to snap myself out of those moments. But again, sometimes it's okay to allow myself to feel very deeply and feel the trauma too. I think that can be healthy within reason when you're writing a story.
So you mentioned something that what was coming to me is the fact that since this is a trilogy
Yes.
and we're talking about character development and the layers that are involved to do that, it's one thing to do that for one book. It's another thing to do that for multiple books. So how did you go about making sure that Merlin stayed consistent, that when you picked up the next book and then the next book, that you could feel where he was, but yet showing some growth too, because he still might be grieving, but he has grown because of
Mhm.
that. And so how did you keep all of that kind of thing in line?
I think for me, at least with my trilogy, it was a little easier for me because the story really came to me in one chunk. I'm not so much of a pantser, I am a plotter. And usually I know the end and the beginning when I start writing. I might not know all of the details on the inside, but particularly with this story, the major points were kind of already there for me when I started. And it was a long enough story that it was busted up into 3 books. But for me, I had to know my characters. And I think it's really important, just even as a tool for a writer, is to arc your characters complete. Like, you may not, if you're a pantser, that's fine, but you should still at least kind of have an idea of where you're leading your character. I feel like it's really smart to know, okay, what is going to be their growth pattern? Because you do want to have the same character throughout. You want to have them on that projection. And so I had to really sit down, especially with Eleanor was more of a challenge. I connected far more with Merlin than Eleanor. And yet it was funny. I found out that a lot of what was hindering me with Eleanor was some of my own disconnections in my real life. She was
Oh,
the one that taught me the most, honestly, in all of my books. She spoke to me the loudest, and she was the one that I had to overcome the most to write. And so for her, there were times where her character arc kind of got a little bumpy, and it was hard for her to be conveyed properly because I was still hiding. And so I had to really understand her so that as I was writing her, even in her progression, I already knew who she was. And I knew what kind of things would trigger her, what kind of things would set her off. And I also knew where I wanted her to end. And I knew that someone who's fatherless, I wanted there to be a connection with understanding who she was and an understanding of what a father was. And so there needed to be those golden moments throughout where there was a powerful transition. And I think, there's the hero's journey that we want to have in each of our stories that we're telling. What are the mountain peak places where they're going to gain something before they move on with the story? And it can kind of look a little bit like this as you're writing the story, but we want to get them to the prize. And I know in each book there were these pivotal moments for my characters where they kind of, what's the word I'm looking for, where they kind of like amped up a little bit. They would learn a lesson. And yet in book 3, which I had planned, was that everything's going to fall apart again. And so, like we were discussing earlier, but this is where we get to find out, did it stick?
mhm.
When they got to the mountain and they discovered what they needed to, or they got the healing or the breakthrough, is it going to stick when everything falls apart again? And that was a really important theme for me throughout developing my stories and my characters, was that in real life, it's not always grass is greener on the other side. The bad guy gets triumphed in this scene and then he's never there again. Or, life is life. And there's so many treasures and moments of triumph, but that doesn't mean that bad things won't still happen. But that doesn't have to rob from us what we've gained as we've grown as human beings. And so for me, I had to really connect with each of those characters as I was telling the story, so that by book 3, I wasn't betraying what I had already written. And even the new characters that were coming in could come in without shifting that purpose.
I love that. I love how you describe that, and going back to arcing, outlining, and even if you're a pantser and
Yeah.
you've written, going back, when you're rereading, going back through to start doing more edits, more layers, outlining, this is what I'm seeing, this is writing out your arc, then you still can do it. You can still do that, and it will help you to see, am I hitting the points where I need to? Am I
Yes.
missing something? Do I see balance in my characters? Because to your point, Merlin had to be strong, but Eleanor had to be strong too. And
Yes.
they needed to be on par with each other.
Yes.
And that's going to also, when you're going back through and reading and seeing what's going on, and even if you've plotted it and you're going through your final pass before you really start to move towards line and copy and what have you, go back and still make sure, are they still balanced or balanced enough? One still
Yes.
might be stronger in one chapter than another, but on the whole, can you feel both present? Can you feel those characters
Yes.
like you're intending?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that's where it's even valuable to have other people who are writers or authors that are on your team. Because I know for me, you get lost in your own stuff sometimes. I can look at somebody else's manuscript and really help them develop and, see where they might need to kink things or change things. And for me, when I look at my stuff, sometimes you can kind of get blind because
Mhm.
you've written it, you've read it so many times, and I have the hardest time editing my own work because I know what it's supposed to say, so my eyes just skip over all the errors.
Yeah.
But having an author friend who can, and Stephanie Cotta, who's an author, she is one of my go-tos, where I'll be like, could you please just look at this chapter? You've read all my other books. You know who Merlin is and you know who Eleanor is. Am I staying true to who they are? Does this seem like this makes sense in the story? And being able to get that feedback from somebody who's willing to be honest with you and say, actually, you need to tweak this, or this doesn't really seem like something that they would do, really helps me as I'm writing a story.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And even if you haven't shared your work with anyone yet, and it does feel scary and brave in the same step to do so, it's really worth doing, whether it's
Yeah.
a friend to read it, like you're saying, or if it's an editor, a developmental editor to read it and to give you feedback. The more that you find trusted people to add to your, to be a part of your village, to be a part of your community, who can be cheerleaders for you too. I mean, you might
Yes.
even be able to reach out to that person and go, I just need a moment. I need a pep talk, or can you remind me of this and this? I just need that little boost of confidence. That's okay. Ask for that, because just as much as you might need constructive and kind feedback, you also want to, there might be times when you need that pat on the back, and it's okay to ask for it. It's okay to say, this is what I need, and keep going.
Yes.
Absolutely. Angela, this has been awesome. Where can people connect with you? Where can they get your books, be a part of your world?
Well, you can find me on angelarhughes.com. That's really the one-stop place where you can find all of the information about me. Of course, I'm on Instagram, Facebook, all of the socials. And also my friend Stephanie and I are on a podcast. We do a podcast called The Ink Mages. That is all on my website. And also, if you are interested in doing coaching with me, that is also on my website. But everything, every social, everything you can find at AngelaRHughes.com, or you can go to my link tree, which is Linktree, Angela R. Hughes, and you can find all of the ways to connect with me.
This has been awesome. Thank you so much for being on the show. I've had a blast with you.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a very fun conversation. I feel like we could have just kept talking.
Thank you so much.